Hello, my name is Joseph Parks, and I will be presenting for the Introduction to Cognitive Neuroscience Fall 2022 semester. The article I'll go over today is Eye Movements Reveal Attention to Social Information in Autism Spectrum Disorder. It was published in 2008. Now, this study has quite a lot of failings, but first, let's go through the introduction, where we introduce what ASD is and what the researchers are interested in. ASD is a neurodevelopmental condition where children show reduced attention to social aspects of the environment. This has been hypothesized to be different in adults diagnosed with ASD. The researchers think that eye movements and eye tracking and visual attention are crucial for social interaction, which is why they measure them. And they use eye tracking and visual attention to investigate how the symptom may be absent in adults. The literature review, they build their procedure and methods based on a couple of earlier experiments. Children with ASD have already been shown to have social attention deficits in interactive and picture viewing designs. This experiment is a picture viewing design experiment. Adults not diagnosed with ASD have also been shown to prefer images with social stimuli. The experimenters here hope to contrast adults with ASD with adults not diagnosed with ASD. First, we'll go over the population of this experiment. It was first the population was split into a 2x2 experimental design with the independent variable of the individual either having a diagnosis of ASD or not, and either being an adolescent or an adult. Something to note here is that there are only 2 adults per testing condition, meaning 2 adults diagnosed with ASD and 2 adults not diagnosed with ASD. In comparison, there's still only a small number of adolescents, but there are 15 in the no ASD diagnosis condition and 12 in the ASD diagnosis condition, which is quite a few more than the adults contained. This is quite a challenge, especially because they want to make inferences and implications about adults with ASD. The design of the experiment, per experimental stimulus, 2 scenes are shown, one social scene and one not social scene. 40 pairs of scenes total were recorded. Each pair is a single experimental stimulus. One display would have a pair of a scene of a person present and a scene with a person absent. The pairs are matched to avoid confounds. Some confounds they made note of were setting, location of one scene in relation to the other, direction of gaze of the person in the PP scene in relation to the other scene, and details regarding the person, such as posture, point of fixation, head angle, and gender. Other materials in the experiment were the color monitors to display the stimuli, the eye tracker, which made 200 recordings per second, and the buttons for the second half of the experiment. There are 2 halves. The first half is a free view, and the second half, the subjects were given a task. Before we get into the halves of the experiment, let's go over the early procedures, such as the participants were given an information sheet for disclosure and consent, and also a calibration for the eye tracker, a 9-point calibration, to make sure that it was recording accurate findings. The first half of the experiment was the free viewing half. Each experimental stimulus came with a set of stimuli to make sure that the findings were sound. First, there was a 1-second blank screen. Then a 1-second center fixation prompt to make sure that that subjects were not already paying attention to a certain area of the screen, and that might confound the results. And then given a 3-second experimental stimulus, being one of the 40 pairs of scenes. Participants in total viewed 21 stimuli in this first half of the experiment. The first being a practice run that was not recorded with the rest of the data. Overall, 20 stimuli were recorded for the results. The second half of the experiment was gender discrimination, in which participants were given the task to determine the gender of the person in the person-present stimulus. And then when they determined the gender, to press a button, the button described earlier in the material section. Participants were shown 23 stimuli here, the first of 3 being practiced and not counted in the findings. Something to note were that there's only 1 practice run in the first half and 3 practice runs in the second half. For the results section, there were very few significant findings. The experimenters reduce, to begin with, the complexity and details in the results. Instead of noting the age of participants, they end up doing only 2 pools, one of participants with a diagnosis and one without a diagnosis of ASD. This really complicates things because the researchers desire results that tell us about the adult population of participants with an ASD diagnosis. But you can't make results and you can't make inferences about adults based on a population of adolescents. As I said before, most of the participants in this experiment are adolescents. Just to talk about the population of participants with a diagnosis, 12 were adolescents and 2 were adults. You cannot make findings and conclusions about adults based on such a large population of adolescents, or a majority being adolescents. Both pools, as I said, reduced to whether or not they have the diagnosis, regardless of age, had the same response to the gender discrimination task. The difference the researchers note here is that they noted that the preference for social information appeared less strong or absent in participants with an ASD diagnosis. They noted that there was no spontaneous gaze following in the free gaze condition for participants with an ASD diagnosis, while participants without the diagnosis did show spontaneous gaze following. We will describe how this is sort of a problematic results to focus on later in this slide. The desired implications of these scientists is that people with the ASD maintain issues into adulthood regarding social cues and social attention. This leads to a grim prognosis for people with ASD, and it seems that there is not much improvement as life progresses. One needs to pay attention to the limitations of the studies, though, and take a lot of this with a grain of salt. For one thing, the age range of population size. Due to how small in general this population is, there is a high probability of type 1 and type 2 errors. In addition to this, there is an overwhelming amount of adolescents in relation to adults. For example, there being 6 times as many adolescents as adults in the diagnosis present pool, which makes it impossible to have good findings regarding adults. Another limitation were only high-functioning people with an ASD diagnosis who were involved in this experiment. This quite limits the generalizability of these results. Another limitation was there were slight differences in the first and second part of the experiment, being the number of practice stimuli. I think it's interesting in the first half of the experiment, with there being only 1 practice stimulus, as compared to 3 in the second half, that was the one with the fewer number of practice stimuli is the one we got actual different results. It could be a factor. And one that would be easily solved by just adding 2 more practice stimuli in the first half of the experiment. Now I will go over the issue with the method of measurement used, especially with regards to the finding of no spontaneous gaze following being seen as significant. One of the diagnostic requirements for autism spectrum disorder is difficulty making eye contact. I think it is quite problematic to have an eye tracking measure used when eye contact is a diagnostic requirement for people with for autism spectrum disorder. It leads to confounds and making this seemingly significant finding actually a bit meaningless, especially since the other responses showed no difference between the pools. Again, this could be the result of a statistical error, but the researchers sort of should have spoken of that. The researchers make a further potential study, for example, altering the level of social content present with the complexity of this content. While both of these avenues are interesting and tell us more about the dynamics of social attention in people with autism spectrum disorder, the whole method of study needs to be revised. While their desired implication is that adults with ASD do not change with age in regard to social cues, this experiment is so flawed. Yeah, it's for one thing, it is majority adolescents. You cannot make findings on adults based on adolescents. Also, all the adults in this experiment were women, because autism spectrum disorder is something that manifests quite differently depending on gender. You cannot talk about the broad community when only examining one gender. I also wonder about the ethnic and race distribution of this experiment. I think the true implications of this experiment are that research with people with ASD is very flawed and needs to be restructured. One needs to make sure to take into account the diagnostic factors, such as difficulty making eye contact being a diagnostic condition for autism spectrum disorder. And for example, not using no spontaneous gaze following in the free gaze condition as something that should be of note. I think there have also been many other studies regarding autism spectrum disorder that try to make very, very broad implications with such a small sample size, such as the infamous study on vaccinations leading to autism, with such a limited subject pool of 12 individuals, and only all these 12 individuals were originating from the same doctor. Very strange. The implication of this study is that research involving individuals with autism is quite limited and quite messy. It needs to be reformed. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.